Hello, everybody. Thank you all for coming out to the Bexley Public Library. My name is Zach. I'm the programming librarian here. Really quick before we get started, because of the topic of tonight's conversation, I just want to steer some people, if you're interested in some local environmental and sustainability initiatives, you can check out Green Bexley. So they have a website, greenbexley.org, or you can follow them on social media for some local environmental initiatives that are happening in Bexley. So again, thank you for joining us at the library. This is also a hybrid event, so we have some people joining online. For those joining the live stream, feel free to type any questions or comments into the chat at any time, and we will try to get them asked at the end. Tonight, we're very lucky to be joined by Dr. Kelsea Best, who is an assistant professor of civil, environmental, and geodetic engineering and city and regional planning at The Ohio State University. Dr. Best's research focuses on understanding how climate change interacts with human societies and infrastructure, how people may adapt to climate change effects, and how climate adaptation measures can be designed and implemented in a just and equitable way. She's also the co-author of the book, Migration and Displacement in a Changing Climate, which will be the topic of tonight's conversation. And she is joined by sustainability expert Jennie McAdams, who will be moderating tonight's conversation. Please join me in welcoming Jennie and Kelsea.
Thanks, Zach. Thanks so much for having us. I'm going to go ahead and ask some questions, and feel free if you have any additional questions at the end, let us know, and we'll get started. So, Kelsea, can you talk a little bit about the relationship between climate change and migration, specifically what got you started in the book and what that relationship is?
Sure. So I started studying this topic in grad school. My dissertation was focused on climate-related migration in Bangladesh specifically. And it just opened up this whole broad research area that is really looking at the ways ultimately that people make decisions to move or to stay in a place that's experiencing the effects of climate change. And so we know that that can be very complex. So if people here think about maybe a decision you've made in your life at any point to move for any reason, there's probably a lot of factors that went into that decision. So we think about individual level factors, things like age, family size and structure, livelihood, but then we also think about these more macro level forces, so the political environment, economic opportunities, and then the environment is one of those higher level dynamics that can influence that ultimately very personal decision to move or to stay. And the environment can interact through some of those other processes too. So a lot of the examples in the book, it's full of case studies, are examples of farmers around the world, for example, who might find their livelihoods threatened by climate changes, and then that triggers that decision-making process to move or to stay. So for me, that's part of what makes this topic so interesting and why it was enough to fill a book, is that it really is this interesting combination of individual choices and these macro level changes.
Thank you so much. Now, I know there's different kinds of climate issues and weather. Here in Ohio, we probably don't see as many tsunamis or hurricanes, but we definitely have our climate issues. So how do different kinds of those impact migration in terms of climate migration?
Yeah, that's a great question. So generally, we think about climate effects as either being rapid or slow onset. So rapid onset is something like the tsunami or a hurricane that's a disaster that comes on suddenly, usually causes severe damage, whereas slow onset is more of those kind of creeping effects of climate change. So global temperatures rising, summers getting on average hotter, sea level rise is a big one where you don't see that immediate impact, but you feel it more and more over time. And so when we think about the rapid versus slow onset effects, they do have a different effect on that migration decision. Usually with the rapid onset disaster type events, we might see more displacement. So that is different from migration in that it's less of a planned process. We think about it usually as less voluntary, so it's a forced movement. So In the case of the fires in the Los Angeles area recently, that was a rapid onset event. People lost their homes and might have been forced to move and be displaced. With the slower onset effects, so things like places becoming hotter, harder to live without AC, or more frequent flooding with sea level rise, usually people can plan a little bit more for those migrations. So rather than displacement, it is really more often to be something that is intentional, that maybe is sought out as a deliberate adaptation strategy. So a household might notice that over time, for example, their crops are not doing as well, they're failing more and more, and make that choice to try to seek a better life elsewhere. And so that's kind of the general pattern that we see. But then even within those, we have a lot of variation. It is very context specific. And again, the book has a lot of great case studies from around the world. And it is divided into chapters that focus on those climate effects. So if you were really interested in sea level rise or heat, there's a chapter for that in the book.
Speaking of sort of the changing, or the climate and the migration, do you find, or did you find in the examples that there was more or about equal financial reasons, or more health reasons, or just livelihood in general, or is it kind of across the board?
It is across the board. I would say that the strongest reason usually is financial or some kind of livelihood connection. That could be, like I mentioned, trying to find a different place to be a farmer if one's crops are failing. That could be, very commonly, we see rural to urban migration, so people going into cities to find different livelihood opportunities. That's extremely common in Bangladesh, where I've done a lot of my work, especially this kind of seasonal migration. So people will go, if there's a certain period where a crop has failed, they might temporarily go into a city. In the case of Bangladesh, it's Dhaka, the capital city, and they might pull rickshaws or have some other kind of labor in the city until they can bring money back. And that can be a really important process too, to also build resilience in their original homes. So sending that money back or bringing that money back can actually help them in the longer term stay in their place of origin and respond and adapt. Generally, and again, I think maybe we can relate, some of us can relate, people want to stay in their homes for the most part. In some of these contexts, people have really deep ties, ancestral ties, generational ties to a place. And so in many cases, the first choice is to try to build resilience in that place and stay where possible.
Great, thank you. Can you talk a little bit about what inspired you to write this book or to do this research?
Yes, so as I mentioned, my dissertation work was focused on coastal Bangladesh, and my first year of my PhD, I was lucky enough to be able to go over to Bangladesh with a group of researchers, and I was working with this very diverse group of scholars. So we had sedimentologists and hydrologists, geophysicists, and then we had social scientists as well. So we had political scientists, psychologists, and really I was brought on the team and was tasked with essentially integrating those different ways of knowing to try to understand how the physical and the social ultimately influenced migration. And I think really, like I said before, I kind of fell in love with just the complexity of that and bringing together different ways of knowing, different data sets to understand what is ultimately a personal process. And then the story of the book is actually kind of funny because it was a great case of meet your heroes. Sometimes they say don't meet your heroes, but this is actually, there was a previous version of this book that was written 10 years ago by Dr. Robert Micklem, who's the second author. Maybe he's the third author, but a senior colleague, and his work had inspired so much of my own research. And he actually tweeted, back when Twitter was alive and well, that he was looking to write a new book and wanted to bring in a more junior colleague. And I had never met him, and so I emailed him my CV and a talk I'd given, and he said, okay, let's write a book. And then we brought Kaylee Ober on as well, and we actually wrote most of the book over Zoom, having never met in person. It was actually later down the line that we actually got together. But it was a fun way to write a book.
That's really, so you didn't retweet him or I'll do the book with you.
Yeah, he said he got some emails and sorted through, and I was very lucky. So he is close to retirement, and I think he wanted to pass the torch a bit, but it was an amazing process to work with him.
That's really amazing. It's always good to meet your heroes and have that be a good experience.
Right, and have them be wonderful, generous people. Yeah,
for sure. What are the implications for your work in the United States as a whole?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think sometimes when I'm talking about this work, people might think that this is a elsewhere issue, right? And I talk about Bangladesh, and I talk about places that are far away and maybe hard to picture. But really, this is an everywhere issue, and the US actually experiences some of the highest rates of displacement from natural disasters in the world. And so even just in the past year, we can think of events here in this country, the flooding in Texas. I mentioned the wildfires in Los Angeles. So these events are not uncommon, where there's some kind of disaster and people are forced to move for some period of time. That could be temporary displacement, and they're able to come back, or it could be permanent. And it does take a while to see how that plays out. So there are plenty of examples that are focused on the US in the book as well, and I think that was important for us to really show that this is a here problem as well. And ultimately, the dynamics are the same if it's in the US, in a community in Florida that's impacted by a hurricane versus a community in coastal Bangladesh that's impacted by a tropical cyclone. There's a lot of similarities. And then kind of bringing it to Ohio, so another dimension of this that's more emerging is, for a long time, researchers were very focused on what made people leave a certain place, what pushed someone, drove them to leave. And now we're realizing that we also need to think much more about where people go when they do leave. So receiving communities, or climate destinations, we might call them. So in the US, there's this interesting kind of emerging conversation that I know you're familiar with around climate havens, and thinking about where, as more people are moving and intentionally making that choice to move, where they might go. So places like Ohio and central Ohio might look pretty attractive as the effects of climate change get worse. You know, we have a relatively mild climate, we have water, and so places are starting to plan for a potential influx of climate-related migrants. If you look at Buffalo, New York's government website, I think it's fascinating. Right up front, they say, we have a cool climate and we have water, so come to Buffalo. So really, it's starting to be kind of a proactive strategy in some places to draw people in.
In your research, have you seen any other, whether it's in the United States or in other nations, ways that they've prepared for climate migration, or ways that they've, I guess, beefed up some of their infrastructure for this?
Yeah, so it is very much emerging, and I know I'm a bit biased, but the place that I've seen doing this the most is Bangladesh, actually. And it was where I first saw this concept of intentionally planning for climate migrant-friendly communities. That's the language they use. So with the just amount of people living in Bangladesh, it's one of the most densely populated countries in the world. There's a lot of migration into the capital city of Dhaka. The infrastructure there is already strained. So the government of Bangladesh, with scholars and community-based organizations there, have picked a few satellite cities that they're really trying to draw migrants to as a way of relieving that pressure on Dhaka. So they have plans to make sure there's adequate infrastructure in these places, so housing, employment opportunities, education opportunities, and really the goal is to make those places more attractive than Dhaka so that people can go there and have a better life. And I think it very much remains to be seen how effective that is, but I had a student who actually went to one of these satellite cities, Mongla, and was interviewing people, including migrants, to try to understand so far how that experience was. But what I think will be a lesson and will be important for any place that wants to attract climate migrants is you have to have the infrastructure in place to support people who come in. So in the United States, we all know there's a housing affordability crisis pretty much across the country. So if a city is going to bring in a large population, there needs to be housing, it needs to be affordable, you have to have all the other critical infrastructure that we depend on, so our water services, adequate electricity access, all of these things I think need to be really intentional, especially if a place is going to say, come here because we have water and a relatively cool climate. And the other piece that is really interesting too is also, and I think Bangladesh is also considering this, is the social cohesion. So also having a place that will be welcoming and will help integrate people as they come in. We hear the rhetoric out there that is very anti-immigrant. There's a lot of animosity and fear, and so the social piece is also really important when we think about this.
That's definitely something I think we don't always think about in terms of climate change or migration in general, is just that social cohesion component. So thank you for bringing that up.
Yeah.
Going back just a little bit, I know you said that you met the author through Twitter. Twitter came up and then you worked on it through Zoom. Can you tell a little bit more about the process of writing the book? Was it all through Zoom? Was it collaborative emails back and forth?
Yes, there were a lot of emails. So once we came together as a team, we already had contacts with the publisher, Cambridge University Press, through the first book that came out 10 years ago. And this is my first time writing a book, so I learned a lot through the process. We had to put together a proposal for this book. They send that proposal out for peer review, essentially. And so it's an extended outline, a description of the audience. We get reviewer comments back. And then at that point, we got the thumbs up to run with it. And at first, we did some dividing and conquering on specific chapters. So for example, I started with the methods chapter in here, which might not be the most exciting chapter to some in the audience, but I'm a modeler and I got really excited about writing that chapter. Kaylee Ober she works in DC, she is a policy person, she took the first pass at the policy chapter, and then we kind of swapped chapters. So we all worked on every chapter to make sure in part that it's cohesive. And yeah, a lot of Zooms in between, a lot of emails. There was one really frightening moment where we thought that all of our chapters in our Google Drive had vanished. We found them, but that was not a good day. And then from there, it took about a year to actually get all of the text, and then about another year to go through all of the editing, back and forth references. We were talking before about the joys of references and citations. So in total, about 2 years to get it out. I will say, I think the most fun part was that they let me pick the cover art, and I think it turned out really nice.
Where is that?
This is so embarrassing, I actually don't know. They sent me some options, and I was like, that one's pretty.
It is. I would agree it is. So in terms of, I mean, we're hearing news every day. There's climate impacts every day. Things are changing. When you were writing this, how did you decide, okay, we can't keep adding we can't keep adding to this, like we have to stop and like go forward with it? Because I know that there's just so much coming out every day.
Yeah, that was definitely a challenge. And there's a bit in the foreword to the book that recognizes that the book is already dated in some ways. You know, we worked really hard to present the state of the science to the point that we had to stop writing, and even we pushed it a little bit beyond that when it was going through the editing process, because a new study would come out or statistics would be updated, and we'd say, no, we really need to get this in. So I think it came with the recognition of that this is such a rapidly evolving space. It's why we really needed to write an entirely new book 10 years after the first one came out. You know, we hope it can hold up for another 10 years, but it's going to keep changing. So the last chapter in here is about those emerging issues and areas where we really think the research has plenty of room to grow, and we think people will focus a bit more. So the hope is that when we do rewrite the book in 10 years, I'll be re-energized by then, that, you know, those blurbs essentially of future work will perhaps be their own chapters.
Do you have a folder on your desktop called Future Case Studies for the next book that you're putting in?
No, but that's a great idea. I really should. Honestly, when it came out, I was like, I might need a few years away from the book. But that is a very good idea. And my own research continues in this area. I'm doing some work now that's much more US focused, looking at post-disaster recovery, those implications for displacement and movement. Another area I'll just share that I'm really interested in is a concept called climate gentrification. So some of us are likely familiar with the term gentrification in general. It refers to the process of generally wealthier, whiter people moving into lower income, generally communities of color, raising property values and displacing those more disadvantaged residents. We're starting to think now about how climate change can also interact with that process. So for example, as people recognize that maybe certain areas are flooding less than others, that property becomes more valuable, more desirable, and certain people could be displaced into higher risk areas. This is already happening in communities in Miami, Florida. There's a community called Little Haiti in Miami that I've been to Miami with a student, talked to people there. Literally, developers noticed that when the city of Miami would have issues with flooding, Little Haiti didn't flood. And that was because it's on this higher elevation ridge, this naturally occurring higher elevation. So developers started really aggressively moving into that community. The residents there are protesting and really doing what they can to resist, but it's actively in that process of climate gentrification.
Well, kind of speaking of the gentrification and the policy aspects, what are some of the policy implications of this work, and specifically probably United States policy implications?
I think it connects so closely to general immigration policy, and right in the foreword we upfront say that our approach in this book is that migration is not good or bad. It's a part of human existence for all of time. People move for all kinds of reasons, and people shouldn't be villainized for moving. So we know that this kind of movement will continue to increase. The best projection I've seen is that around 200 million people a year might be moving for climate-related reasons by the 2050s. So that's most of our lifetime. So we need to, I think, change the way we think about that movement. And the other part of that is the proactive planning that I mentioned, having the infrastructure in place. And then at a much higher level, so we have international legal definitions of refugees through the UN, and being having that legal status of a refugee awards someone a certain level of protections, certain rights when they are displaced into another country. That legal definition currently does not include any kind of climate-related displacement. So if people are reading the news or popular, stories about this, you'll see the term climate refugee. It was part of what kind of popularized, because I think it has this emotional heft. But the term climate refugee actually does not exist in international law, which right now is just a huge gap in that policy. So those protections that are awarded on the international playing field to things like discrimination, war, prosecution, do not apply to people who are fleeing the effects of climate change.
Can you talk anything about like some of the small or large changes that we could do, either at the local level or the state level, to either prepare for some of this climate migration or mitigate some of these factors?
So one of the best things that we can do if we do want to dampen this increased migration, again, not that migration is good or bad, but coming back to this idea that generally people want to stay in their homes. So one of the best things we can do is mitigate those effects of climate change overall. We know that we're on a certain trajectory with our global emissions, but how bad the effects get really depends on our decisions as individuals, as a global community. So there's still a lot of room in terms of how severe those effects get. So mitigating climate change, by emitting fewer greenhouse gases, switching to renewable energy, more efficient technologies, that is the biggest thing we can do. And then at more of a local level, investing in adaptations in place. And again, we have examples of individual households doing this with, their own technologies. There's a lot of indigenous knowledge in how to respond to changing environments that's becoming much more appreciated, I would say. But in general, building our resilience where we are. And so that's understanding in our own communities what our risks are. So as you know better than me, in central Ohio, we really need to be concerned about heat and flooding. So understanding those hazards, and then we can start to build our resilience towards those hazards with things like increased tree canopy to disrupt the urban heat island effect, or better stormwater management and green infrastructure to reduce our flood risks. All of those things are, in the short or long term, going to be connected to these questions of where people move. And then one more thing that comes to mind is they're still a bit rare, but there are whole communities that are having very serious conversations about moving their entire communities to lower risk areas. It's a process called managed retreat. So rather than this unplanned displacement, some communities, especially some low-lying island nations, there's examples of Native Alaskan communities, they're getting together as a community, talking about what leaving might mean for them, developing a process that can be implemented over time. And it's really challenging, it's expensive, it's emotional, but those conversations are happening as well as, okay, maybe we can't stay here, and so we really need to come together to move.
In those conversations, do you find them, or in the case studies, have they been at the governmental level or sort of at the grassroots level of we as a community need to discuss this?
There are examples of both, and there aren't many examples. What I would venture to guess from the few examples that I am aware of is that they're most effective when they are grassroots, but they need that governmental support, in part because it is expensive, like I said, and many of these communities, they might be low income, they don't have the resources to transplant entire infrastructure systems elsewhere. So I think if it's driven by the community with support from technical experts, from governments, then that's likely where it's going to be the most effective. Fiji has a really interesting master plan for relocation that includes a lot of intentional community dialogue and engagement, government support. It's voluntary, so it has to be driven by these individual communities. In theory, it sounds great. I know in practice, they've been having trouble with it because these things just get difficult and messy. And again, it's emotional and tied into the sense of home and place attachment. But Fiji at least has the most comprehensive plan, I think, that's out there right now.
That's really interesting. I would not have thought that like a plan was completely like laid out and in place. So that's really interesting. And I would imagine that there are still some discrepancies in those plans of the more vulnerable, and then those who are more able to possibly like just say, yep, we can move, or we can figure that out.
Right. And there's another example of a small town in Wales that has a really interesting plan as well, because they have laid out their plan over 100 years. So they brought together a bunch of technical experts. They looked at sea level rise projections and climate projections, and they mapped out to which point they could withstand the impacts or kind of harden their infrastructure, basically hunker down, and then eventually in this 100-year plan, they have themselves gradually moving back. I would say that is the most complex plan in terms of just how much time they're thinking ahead, but I think it's great. You know, these kinds of questions do require that forward thinking.
Especially as you're looking to either build more infrastructure or switch paths and to move.
Yes, don't get me started on how in this country we still build so much in very high-risk areas.
Well,
it's a whole other conversation.
Stay tuned for 8 o'clock discussion. I know we're about ready for some questions, if there are any.
When you wrote this book, what was your target audience for this book?
So the question was, when you wrote this book, what was your target audience when you were writing this?
We really wanted this book to be accessible to anyone who is interested in this topic. So the audience is, we wanted someone who was in an undergraduate class to be able to take this maybe as a textbook and get a really good overview of the topic. Related to that, we do have educational resources that are free online associated with the book. If someone did want to take it into a classroom, they could kind of just follow the book structure and have a really solid semester-long class. But like I said, it was important to us that anyone who was interested could pick this up and it would be accessible. So we have even a crash course on climate science in here. We don't really assume any previous knowledge about climate change or migration. And then we would also hope that it could be relevant for policymakers or decision makers at different scales. You know, maybe there's a planner in Buffalo, New York, or someone who can take it and better understand some of the complexity involved here. I hope that we were successful in that, and that the language is accessible. It's not overly technical, but really is the state of the science.
You wrote this book and it's been published. How long has it been out?
So the question was, how long has the book been out? It has been out since April.
And do you find that you're getting kind of a cross-reference like you're describing your interest in this book?
So the question was about the interest for the book so far. I have had a few emails that people are planning to use it in classrooms in the fall semester, which is really exciting for me. This field, the academic sphere, is a bit small and tight-knit, so we've had really good feedback from people in the field. There's some blurbs on the back from other experts who have reviewed it. In terms of getting it out to a broader audience, that's why I'm really enjoying doing things like this, because I do want it to get beyond the academic ivory tower and into more people's hands. I will say it was, again, as my first book, it was a bit strange when it came out, and then it was almost a little anticlimactic because then it's out and you want people to read it, and so trying to make sure that people do have access. So it's available on Amazon and also with the publisher. Yeah.
And then my final
Sure.
question would be, does our library, does Bexley Library have copies?
We have it in for purchase for the collection, so coming soon.
Coming soon. I know some local bookstores do have it. I believe $2 Radio has it already. So it's slowly getting out there. I'm trying to get the OSU library to get a copy too. I'm like, come on.
You mentioned climate migration, and I think that they should create a policy allowing migrants from places where the climate. I'm having a hard time coming up with an example of an entire country that the climate has wiped it out, that they would have to migrate. I mean, I can see migrating from one part of Pakistan to another, or part of Bangladesh to another. But I'm worried about your concern for suggesting that policy, because that would just be an excuse for why, like, someone says, well, I'm going to move, I might as well move to the United States. And I'll just claim this as my, so, but anyway, the
We're not going to
question,
be getting into the United States.
probably not.
I can tell you, so.
Probably not. But my question is,
Yeah.
is there an entire country, or, I just couldn't think of any.
Yeah.
So the question is there an entire country or a nation that's being impacted by this where they would move en masse or migrate en masse, or is this more of smaller pockets or smaller sort of areas that would migrate?
It's a great question, and I should say that most of this movement to date is internal, so within country borders. There is also some movement crossing country borders. The only example of whole countries that are really facing this as an existential challenge now is these low-lying island nations. So places like the Maldives or Fiji, they're islands, and with the rates of sea level rise, they very likely won't exist in 50 plus years. So that is really the only case where it is existential. It's an entire country that might have to move. In that case, there are some interesting examples of other countries, conversations about land that those people might be able to go to. So in the case of the Maldives, I know Australia has been in conversation with, okay, if this whole group of people does need to move, here's where they could go potentially. But you do, I think, with a lot of these questions related to climate change, get into this tricky concept of responsibility, where we know that it's the wealthier, largely global north countries that have contributed the most to this problem in terms of just emissions, just amount of emissions, and it's lower income countries that have contributed much less that are, at least now, experiencing a lot of the burden and have fewer resources to be able to respond. So when I say that we need some kind of international policy that includes climate refugees, it's really, I think I'm talking about a basic set of international norms like we have for refugees who are fleeing for other reasons. So the United States has not necessarily been abiding by those international norms currently in international laws, but we do have UN frameworks that say if someone is fleeing because of violence or prosecution and persecution, then they are required to be given safe haven. They're not allowed to be sent back to a place where they're fleeing because of fear of their lives. And so we do have these frameworks that include a lot of different kinds of movements, and it just seems like a a gap where the international community, I think, will need to do more to really say, okay, how are we going to deal with this challenge? And it will increasingly be potentially cross borders, especially if there are more regional effects, like increased heat in certain places around the equator. We could start to see much more mass migration. But the other thing that is emerging a bit is we're starting to see more regional policy conversations. So certain areas in Africa, for example, multiple countries might come together and try to develop a strategy for this kind of migration. And all of this, right, is getting into tricky policy questions and assuming a level of international cooperation with this backdrop of just a lot of fear and concern around immigration in general. So I'm not necessarily optimistic that that will happen anytime soon, but in terms of why people are moving, it feels like a significant gap. So I hope that answers your question. And at the same time, most of it is internal. A lot of the burden will fall on individual countries to kind of handle their own changes in population and shifts, but it's also a global challenge. Did that answer your question mostly?
Yeah, I used to live in DC, so
Yeah.
when somebody talks about policy, I was just like, oh.
Yes, yeah.
It sounds like it's more vague at this point in time. Like something
Yes.
versus
And
concern right now.
right, and we have international frameworks as well around or attempts to mitigate climate change. So we have the Intergovernmental Panel for Climate Change. We have annual conventions of parties where nations send representatives and talk about mitigation of climate change and more adaptation. So I will also say that migration is entering those conversations more. There's an interesting concept called loss and damages that's a big part of those policy conversations now, which is recognizing that the wealthier countries have contributed more. So there's actually an international fund now where it's voluntary, but in theory, wealthier countries pay into this fund, and that money goes to lower income countries to help them adapt and respond. Again, in theory, that money could be used for more resilient infrastructure, for climate migrant-friendly cities, et cetera. So we have some of these policy frameworks, and it is still somewhat new how these questions are being integrated, but it feels important, if that makes sense. But certainly you would know better than me how messy the policy making is. Yeah.
Are there any questions from online?
We had a few people ask where they can buy the book, so I put the link in there for them.
Great, thank you.
And someone had a global north versus global south question, which you just hit on.
Okay.
Well, Kelsey and Jenny, thank you so much for this fascinating conversation tonight and such a vital topic for us all to be considering. So thank you again, and please go and find the book.
Great. Thank you so much. Thank you all.